The night was cold, and the wind carried the scent of pine through the vast silence of the western frontier. Inside a forgotten cabin, tucked away in the shadows of the hills, a young bride sat alone, her white dress torn and stained by dust. She had not chosen this isolation. She had been pushed into it. Rejected at the altar, humiliated before the entire town, she sought refuge in the only place no one dared to look. A cabin spoken of in whispers, a place with a history as dark as the surrounding woods. The flicker of the dying fire seemed to echo her broken spirit. Yet beneath her sorrow, something stronger stirred, an instinct that told her this night would not end in silence. As the moon rose higher, the cabin's stillness began to change. The walls, worn and scarred, seemed to breathe with old memories. Each creak of the floor, each rustle of the branches outside, grew heavier, as if announcing that she was not as alone as she had believed. Her heart raced, torn between fear and curiosity, because deep down she sensed what the townsfolk had always feared. This cabin did not belong to her. It belonged to someone who had left long ago, and who might not forgive an intruder. She pressed her back against the wall, her veil clinging to her face like a ghostly shroud. The silence was suddenly broken by the low, deliberate crunch of boots outside. Not hurried, not lost. These steps were certain, each one closer, steady as the ticking of a clock. She held her breath, her hands trembling against the rough wood of the chair she clutched. Whoever it was had no need of a lantern. They knew this land, this forest, and most of all this cabin. The door creaked open without force, as though the very hinges had been waiting for the weight of that hand. A figure filled the doorway, tall and shadowed, with eyes that seemed to catch the firelight before any other part of him did. He stepped inside without hesitation, his presence overwhelming, as if the cabin itself welcomed its rightful master back home. And there, in the flickering glow, the rejected bride realized she was no longer hidden. She had been discovered. In that instant, time seemed to stretch. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken questions. Who was this man who claimed the night as his own? Was he an outlaw, a wanderer, or something even more dangerous? Someone tied to the very reason this cabin was feared. Her pulse hammered in her ears, torn between the urge to flee and the paralyzing pull of his gaze. One thing was certain. The humiliation of her past was nothing compared to the secret she was about to uncover in the heart of the Old West. The bride, still trembling in the dim glow of the fire, studied the man who had returned to claim the cabin. His face was weathered, carved with lines of hardship, and his eyes carried a silence heavier than the wilderness itself. He set his rifle against the doorframe with a calmness that chilled her blood, as though he had already decided her fate without needing a word. The fire crackled between them, but the weight of his stare felt more suffocating than the smoke. In that moment, she realized she was not standing before a stranger. She was standing in the presence of a secret long buried in the dust of the frontier. He finally spoke, his voice low, carrying the gravel of years spent away from men and among shadows. "This cabin doesn't take kindly to intruders," he said, each word measured, deliberate. Yet there was something in his tone that hinted at restraint, as though violence was not his first instinct, even if it could be his last. The bride, her lips dry and trembling, tried to explain her flight from humiliation, but her words caught in her throat. He did not demand an explanation. He simply studied her, as if her presence was both an insult and a revelation. Outside, the night deepened. Coyotes cried in the distance, their voices echoing like omens carried on the wind. Inside, the man moved with quiet purpose, striking a match and lighting a lantern that revealed more of the cabin. Maps nailed to the walls, a collection of weapons, and the scattered remnants of a life lived on the edge of law. The bride's heart pounded as her mind pieced together the whispers she had once overheard in town. This was no ordinary man. This was the figure spoken of in hushed tones, the ghost outlaw who had vanished years ago. The tension between them hung heavy, each second stretching like rope pulled too tight. She wanted to ask who he was, but she feared confirming the name she already suspected. Instead, she clutched her torn veil, the symbol of her shame, while he studied her with a gaze that seemed to pierce deeper than her dress or her fear. It was as if he could see the betrayal that had driven her into these woods, as though her pain mirrored something he himself had carried for too long. At last, he sat across from her, the fire casting sharp shadows over his hardened features. "You ran," he said simply, not as a question, but as a statement, one that stripped her soul bare. She nodded, unable to hold back the tears welling in her eyes. In his silence, she felt both judged and understood. And though her world had collapsed only hours before, she sensed that stepping into this cabin might have delivered her to a fate even more dangerous than the one she fled. The outlaw's presence filled the cabin like a storm cloud, silent yet impossible to ignore. He poured himself a drink from a chipped glass bottle and slid it across the table toward her. She hesitated, unsure if it was an offering of comfort or a test of courage. When she took it, her hands shook, and the burn of the liquor seemed to ignite something deeper inside her chest, something that wasn't just fear but defiance. She was no longer a bride to be pitied. She was a woman standing at the threshold of a dangerous truth. He watched her carefully, his jaw tightening, as if he were weighing a decision that could alter both their lives. Then he leaned forward, his voice a whisper yet heavy as iron. "Do you know whose cabin you've chosen?" The question was a blade hidden in velvet. She swallowed hard, the silence between them growing unbearable. The name she dared not say pressed against her lips, a name cursed in every saloon, blamed for every blood-soaked trail. She shook her head, though deep within, she knew. His eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with recognition. "They told you I was dead," he murmured, almost to himself. The revelation fell like thunder in the small room. She had stumbled into the lair of the man whose return the townsfolk both dreaded and prayed for, the outlaw who had once stood against corrupt sheriffs and greedy ranchers, only to vanish into the wilderness when betrayal carved his soul in two. Now here he was, alive, breathing, and staring into the eyes of a woman who had been cast aside just as he had. The fire roared, the shadows stretching long across the cabin walls, and she felt the weight of destiny settling over her shoulders. She realized she was not just a trespasser. She was a witness to a truth no one else was meant to see. If she left, she could expose him to the world. If she stayed, she would bind herself to a man whose life was marked by blood, loyalty, and vengeance. Her heart raced as she understood the choice was no longer his. It was hers. He rose to his feet, his shadow towering, and walked slowly to the window, scanning the dark horizon. "They'll come looking for you," he said without turning, his tone colder now. "And if they find you here, they'll find me." The bride gripped the glass in her hands until it cracked, her fear blending with a strange sense of belonging. For the first time since her rejection, she was not merely a victim of disgrace. She was part of a secret that could ignite the entire town when dawn came. The night dragged on with a weight that pressed against the walls of the cabin. The outlaw remained near the window, his silhouette outlined by the pale glow of the moon, while the bride sat frozen in the chair, clutching the cracked glass as if it were her last anchor to reality. Every sound beyond the door, the rustle of branches, the distant howl of a wolf, seemed sharper now, charged with danger. She realized that her world had shifted in a single night. She was no longer simply the rejected bride. She was bound to the fate of a man the law feared and the people whispered about. Finally, he turned, his voice like gravel carried on the wind. "You've got two choices," he said, his eyes steady and unflinching. "Leave now, and no one will believe what you've seen. Or stay, and carry the weight of this secret with you." The words were not a threat, but a challenge, and she felt their weight in her bones. Leaving meant going back to humiliation, to a life where her name would forever be tied to disgrace. Staying meant stepping into a world where survival was never promised, where each sunrise could be the last. Her breath caught as she remembered the looks of scorn from the townsfolk, the whispers that she was cursed, unwanted. And yet here, in this cabin of shadows, a strange thought began to burn inside her. Perhaps rejection had not been her ruin, but her path. The outlaw, a man cast out by the world, mirrored her pain in a way no one else could. It was as if fate had drawn two broken souls into the same fire. The realization terrified her as much as it fascinated her. He crossed the room with the slow certainty of a predator, his boots echoing softly against the wood. When he stopped before her, she could feel the weight of his presence pressing down, commanding yet restrained. He studied her face, as though trying to decide if she was strong enough to carry the burden of his life. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes. Loneliness, regret, maybe even hope. But just as quickly, it vanished, replaced by the hardened mask of a man forged in exile. The firelight flickered, casting the two of them in a glow that felt almost sacred, as if the cabin itself bore witness to a covenant neither had chosen, yet both were bound to honor. She lifted her chin, her voice trembling but resolute. "I will not leave." The words sealed her fate, and in that silence, she understood. The story of the rejected bride had ended. What began now was something entirely new, something neither of them could control. The outlaw did not flinch at her declaration, but his jaw tightened, and his hand hovered for a moment near the worn revolver at his side. Not out of threat, but out of habit, as though he measured every word by the edge of survival. Slowly, he stepped back and lit another lantern, flooding the room with more light. The bride saw now that the walls were not just scarred wood. They were marked with maps, coded notes, and symbols carved deep into the beams. This was not merely a cabin. It was a fortress of secrets. He pointed to one of the maps, where trails wound across the frontier like veins. "This land is not what they told you it was," he said, his voice steady. "Behind every ranch, every sheriff's badge, lies a story written in betrayal." She leaned closer, her eyes scanning the faded ink, feeling the tremor in his words. He was not just a fugitive hiding from justice. He was a man holding on to truths the world wanted buried. And now, by stepping into his cabin, she had become part of that hidden history. Her thoughts raced, colliding with fear and fascination. She remembered the sheriff who had sneered when her fiancé abandoned her, the townsfolk who whispered that she was cursed. Suddenly, their cruelty felt connected to something larger, something darker. Perhaps her rejection had been more than just personal shame. It had been the first crack in a mask that covered the rot of the town itself. The outlaw's eyes locked onto hers, and she felt the truth vibrating in her chest. He was not the monster the stories painted him to be. Yet with that truth came danger. "If they find out you're here," he continued, "they'll use you to bring me down. They'll call you a liar, a traitor, or worse." His voice softened, carrying the weight of experience. "But if you stay, you'll see the West as it truly is." The bride's pulse raced as she realized he was not just offering her shelter. He was offering her a place in his world, a world built on the edge of survival and revelation. The fire snapped loudly, a spark leaping into the air as though sealing his words. She felt the gravity of the choice she had made settling into her bones, heavier with every breath. Outside, the night deepened, and somewhere in the distance, the echo of horses on the trail broke the silence. Her eyes widened, but the outlaw's expression remained calm, almost expectant. "They're coming," he said quietly. And in that moment, the rejected bride knew her story had only just begun. The sound of hooves grew louder, rolling across the valley like distant thunder. The bride froze, her hands gripping the edges of the chair as if it could anchor her trembling body. The outlaw, however, remained unshaken. He calmly reached for his rifle, checking the chamber with the ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. His movements were precise, without wasted motion, as though danger was not a surprise, but a companion he had long accepted. The bride's breath came shallow, her heart thundering louder than the horses themselves. "Who are they?" she whispered, her voice nearly drowned out by the pounding hooves. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Riders who answer to men with more greed than honor. They'll claim they're searching for you, but don't believe it. What they want is me." His words sent a chill through her. She had escaped rejection only to find herself caught in the crosshairs of a story far bigger than her own. Lantern light trembled as the horses drew near, their silhouettes passing across the thin window slats. Shadows of armed men moved like phantoms against the cabin walls, and the bride realized just how thin the wood between life and death really was. She clutched her torn veil tighter, as if it could shield her from the storm that pressed against the door. The outlaw motioned for silence, his finger raised to his lips, and she obeyed, her fears silencing even her tears. The cabin was swallowed in stillness. The riders outside slowed, their voices muffled but sharp, words carried on the cold night air. They spoke of the bride, of her disgrace at the altar, of her sudden disappearance. Every detail twisted like a blade in her heart, but she dared not move. To them, she was nothing more than a tool, a lure to drag out the ghost outlaw they feared and hated in equal measure. The outlaw's grip tightened on the rifle, his eyes narrowing as he listened. "They won't wait long," he murmured, almost to himself. Then his gaze fell on her again, steady and piercing. "You said you would stay. Now you'll have to prove it." His words were not a threat, but a vow, and she felt their weight press into her soul. In that instant, she knew there was no turning back. Her life was no longer hers alone. It was tied to his, and to the fate of the West itself. The pounding on the cabin door came sudden and fierce, making the bride jolt as though the world itself were breaking apart. The outlaw didn't flinch. He stood tall, the rifle balanced in his hands, his stance calm but ready. "Open up." A voice barked from outside, harsh and commanding. "We know she's in there. And if she's in there, so are you." The words sent a ripple of dread through the bride's chest, but when she looked at the outlaw, she saw no fear, only fire. He motioned for her to step back, and though her body resisted, her feet obeyed. She pressed herself against the far wall, her eyes locked on the door as if it were the edge of a cliff. The outlaw's shadow stretched across the cabin, tall and unyielding. "You'll say nothing," he ordered, his voice steady. "Your silence is your shield." She nodded, her lips trembling, though a part of her wondered if silence would be enough to protect them. The men outside grew restless, circling the cabin like wolves. Their boots crunched against the earth, their spurs jangling like chains. The bride's pulse quickened with every sound. One of them laughed, a cruel, sharp sound that echoed through the night. "We'll smoke you out if we have to," he shouted. The outlaw's jaw tightened, but he did not answer. Instead, he placed his free hand on the lantern, ready to extinguish it if needed, to plunge the cabin into darkness where shadows could become allies. The tension stretched to the breaking point, each second dripping slow as molasses. The bride's mind raced with the weight of her decision to stay. If she had fled when given the chance, she might have been safe, ashamed, but safe. Yet here she was, standing at the crossroads of fate, her life tethered to a man hunted not just by the law, but by those who twisted the law for their own greed. And strangely, she felt a spark of strength within her, as if rejection had stripped away her fear of judgment, leaving only the raw instinct to survive. The outlaw finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying through the walls. "She isn't here, and if you know what's good for you, you'll ride back before dawn." His words dripped with certainty, a tone that dared them to test him. Silence followed, heavy and uncertain, until the sound of laughter broke it again. But beneath that cruel noise, the bride sensed something shifting, the kind of silence that meant danger was about to erupt, and neither she nor the outlaw could escape untouched. The silence outside the cabin was more suffocating than the pounding on the door had been. The bride clutched the edge of her torn dress, her nails biting into the fabric, her breath shallow, as though the very air had turned against her. The outlaw stood unmoved, his rifle steady in his hands, his eyes fixed on the door. Every creak of wood, every shift of shadow, seemed to sharpen the knife edge of the moment. She realized then that he was not merely prepared for a fight. He was expecting it. A heavy thud shook the cabin wall, followed by the sound of boots scraping against wood. They were trying the shutters, testing the strength of the windows, their voices sharp and mocking in the darkness. "You can't hide forever," one of them snarled. Another laughed, a low and bitter sound. "The girl's not worth saving, outlaw. Hand her over, and maybe we'll let you breathe a little longer." The words cut deep into her chest, turning her shame into a fresh wound. The outlaw's voice rose, steady and cold. "You'll get nothing here but lead and regret." The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. His tone was not a boast, but a promise, and even the bride could feel the power in it, like the rumble of distant thunder before a storm. She realized in that moment why the town both feared and longed for his return. He carried within him the weight of justice no lawman could ever deliver. The riders outside cursed, their voices dripping with rage, and the sound of spurs clashed as they regrouped. The bride's heart pounded so violently she thought it would shatter her ribs. Yet when she looked at the outlaw, she saw something she had not expected. Calmness, a strange serenity, as though the chaos outside only reminded him of who he truly was. She envied that strength, that unshakable defiance in the face of death. And then it came, the metallic click of rifles being cocked, the horses stamping impatiently, the unmistakable sound of men preparing for violence. The bride gripped the wall to steady herself, her eyes wide, her body trembling. The outlaw did not turn to her, but his words were meant for her alone. Whatever happens now, remember, you chose to stay. Those words, soft but unyielding, carved themselves into her soul. She had stepped into his world, and now there would be no return. The first shot shattered the night, splintering wood from the cabin door and filling the room with the stench of gunpowder. The bride screamed, her hands flying to her ears, but the outlaw was already moving, faster than her eyes could follow. He ducked behind the table, rifle raised, his body tense and controlled, like a predator awakened. The firelight flickered wildly, shadows leaping across the walls as bullets tore through the wood around them. She fell to the floor, her breath ragged, the cold dirt beneath her cheek grounding her in the chaos. The outlaw fired once, twice, the crack of his shots echoing like thunder across the valley. Screams rang out in the darkness, men crying out as horses whinnied and scattered. The bride forced herself to lift her head, to watch, even though every instinct told her to shut her eyes and pray. And what she saw was not the man the stories had painted. It was something far more terrifying and awe-inspiring. The outlaw moved with the precision of a man who had lived too long on the edge of survival. Every shot was deliberate, every movement efficient, his body never wasted an ounce of strength. He was not fighting for victory. He was fighting because it was the only language the West understood. And in the glow of fire and gunpowder, the bride saw what it meant to live outside the bounds of law and mercy. He was not just surviving. He was carving his name into the very night. The riders' voices faltered, some cursing, some retreating, others rallying in desperation. The bride crawled toward the corner, her body trembling, but her eyes fixed on the outlaw. In that chaos, she realized something she had not dared to think before. Her rejection at the altar had not been her end, but her beginning. The man who stood between her and death was the mirror of her own fate, discarded, despised, yet burning brighter than those who had cast them aside. A lull fell, the gunfire pausing as the riders regrouped beyond the tree line. Smoke curled through the cracks in the cabin walls, stinging her eyes, and the taste of iron clung to her tongue. The outlaw lowered his rifle for only a moment, his chest rising and falling with measured breaths. Then his gaze turned to her, sharp and unwavering. "They won't stop until one of us is dead," he said. His voice carried no fear, only truth. And in that truth, the bride felt the weight of destiny pressing harder than ever before. The night outside seemed to hold its breath. The bride crouched low, her body trembling with every distant shuffle of boots in the underbrush. Smoke lingered in the cabin, curling through the lantern light, mixing with the iron scent of blood. The outlaw moved with silent precision, reloading his rifle, his expression carved from stone. To him, the gunfire was not chaos. It was routine, as natural as drawing breath. To her, it was a storm she had never known, and yet she found herself unable to look away. From the distance, a voice rose, cruel and sharp, cutting through the night. "You can't run forever, ghost. We'll burn you out." The bride's heart seized to the words, but the outlaw's lips curved into a faint, grim smile. He had been hunted before, and he knew the rhythm of men who relied on fear more than skill. Still, the danger was real, and the bride could see it etched in the lines around his eyes. He was calm, but not careless. He understood that every fight carried the weight of finality. The bride pressed her palm against the rough wood of the wall, her breath ragged. She thought of the church she had fled, the whispers that tore her apart, and the shame that had driven her into the wilderness. Those people had rejected her, as if her worth were nothing. Yet here, in the fire-lit cabin, she realized she was witnessing a man who had also been cast out, branded unworthy by the very laws that corrupted the land. The sting of their shared rejection burned hotter than any bullet. The riders outside shifted again, their movements deliberate, as though preparing for a final push. Horses whinnied nervously, and the metallic clink of spurs pierced the silence. The bride's pulse thundered, but she forced herself to meet the outlaw's gaze. He looked at her, not with pity, but with an intensity that steadied her bones. "This is what it means to stand your ground," he said softly. And though his voice was calm, she felt the gravity of the choice she had made tighten around her, like iron chains. As the voices outside drew closer, she felt something inside her harden. She was no longer the fragile bride who had run from disgrace. She was standing in the heart of a storm, and she knew she would rather face bullets alongside this outlaw than return to the hollow safety of a life built on shame. Her decision had already been made the moment she whispered she would not leave. Now, she would see it through, whatever the dawn might bring. The assault came like lightning. The riders stormed the cabin, their rifles spitting fire into the night, bullets splintering wood and filling the air with thunder. The bride ducked low, her body pressed against the earth as the outlaw rose into the storm, his rifle barking back with deadly precision. Flames leapt in the fireplace, casting their battle into sharp relief, every shadow dancing like a ghost of the men who had fallen before. The air was thick with smoke, cries of rage and agony colliding until they became one terrible chorus. The outlaw moved like a force of nature, his every shot a verdict, his every step unshaken. And yet the bride's eyes followed him, her fear twisting into something deeper, admiration, awe, the unshakable sense that she was watching not a man, but a legend made flesh. In that chaos, she understood why the West whispered his name in both fear and reverence. A rider broke through the window, his boots crashing onto the cabin floor, revolver raised toward her. She screamed, but before the shot could be fired, the outlaw turned with lethal speed, his rifle cracking once. The man fell in a heap at her feet, his lifeless eyes staring into nothing. The bride's chest heaved, tears streaming down her face, but she did not collapse. She clenched her fists, her fear now fused with resolve. The fight raged, but the tide began to turn. The riders, once so bold, faltered under the outlaw's unrelenting fire. Their curses gave way to shouts of retreat, their courage dissolving into the dark. Horses screamed as reins were yanked, hooves thundering back into the wilderness. The cabin, scarred and battered, stood defiant amid the storm, its walls now marked not just by time, but by survival. At last, silence fell again, broken only by the crackle of fire and the outlaw's measured breathing. The bride slowly rose, her body trembling, her dress torn and streaked with soot. She looked at the outlaw, his silhouette framed by smoke and lantern light, and knew she had stepped into a story that could never return to the quiet life she once knew. In that silence, one truth was clear. Rejection had led her here, but destiny would keep her bound to this man and to the untamed heart of the West. The cabin stood silent at dawn, its walls scarred but still standing, just like the souls within it. The rejected bride, once humiliated before the eyes of her town, had faced a night that tested not only her courage but her very identity. In the firelight of violence and truth, she discovered that rejection was not the end. It was the beginning of a path she had never dared to imagine. What was once shame had become strength, forged in the crucible of survival. The outlaw, that ghost of the West, revealed more than his skill with a rifle. He embodied the truth the frontier always whispered, that the ones cast aside often carry the fiercest fire. His defiance against corruption, his will to endure when the world branded him an enemy, mirrored the same resilience the bride had found in herself. They were bound not by chance, but by the shared scars of betrayal. And in those scars lay a power greater than any vow spoken at an altar. As the sun rose over the horizon, painting the wilderness in gold, the bride understood something few ever did. Sometimes destiny does not arrive dressed in celebration or honor. It comes through the ashes of disgrace, through the silence of exile, through the darkness of a cabin where survival demands transformation. In the West, identity was not given, it was claimed, and she had claimed hers in the most brutal of nights. The story of the rejected bride and the outlaw is not merely one of danger and gunfire. It is a reflection of how life often strips us bare before it reveals who we truly are. It asks us to see beyond the eyes of others, beyond their judgment and cruelty, and to discover the fire that waits in our own silence. For in rejection, there can be a rebirth. In exile, there can be truth. And in the heart of fear, courage is born. If this tale moved you, let its echoes remain alive beyond this story. Share your thoughts in the comments. What did this journey stir in you? Did you see yourself in the bride's silence, or in the outlaw's defiance? Remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel, so that together we can keep uncovering stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of the strength hidden in every soul. The West still whispers its truths, and they wait for those brave enough to listen.